Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar Preventing Honor-Based Violence and Oppression in the Nordic Countries. My name is Maja Lundqvist. I work at the Swedish Secretariat for Gender Research at Gothenburg University. I will be the moderator for this webinar, and it's organized by Nordic Information on Gender, also known as NIC, together with the Nordic Welfare Center. NIC is a cooperation body under the Nordic Council of Ministers for Gender Equality and LGBTI, and the Nordic Welfare Center is also an institution within the Nordic Council of Ministers, and they serve as a platform for cooperation between the Nordic countries in the area of social affairs and public health. So we are very happy to be able to do this webinar together with Nordic Welfare Center here at their facilities in Stockholm. So thank you very much for this cooperation. So the title for this webinar is Preventing Honor-Based Violence and Oppression in the Nordic Countries. It takes as its starting point that honor-based violence constitutes violations of people's fundamental freedoms and rights, and that there is also a need to review the work being done in the Nordic region, the work to be able to strengthen a well-functioning preventative work. And in order to do this, the Nordic Council of Ministers in 2024 commissioned NIC to map how the work against honor-based violence is organized in the Nordic region, how the concept is defined, and strengths and challenges with the different approaches, encompassing also specifically LGBTI people's vulnerability to honor-based violence. In addition to that, the assignment also included to conduct a review of legislation concerning honor-based violence and to identify successful methods and approaches to honor-based violence, all in the Nordic region. So over the next 1.5 hours, we will listen to 3 presentations focusing on these different aspects and perspectives of Nordic work to prevent honor-based violence, discussing both possibilities and pitfalls in policy, legislation, and practice. As some of you might have noticed, unfortunately, Anja Bredal, our participant from Norway, her presentation is missing from the program due to Anja being on sick leave. So we send our thoughts and hope for a quick recovery to her, and we look forward to hearing more about her project in the near future. And we're also very happy to see the big interest in this webinar. We are now more than 300 registered to listen to this webinar, and we can also see representation from all the Nordic countries and areas, and also from the Baltic countries. And we see that we have in the audience people from departments and ministries all over the region. We have practitioners and researchers represented, as well as civil society. And as often when discussing issues of violence, many of us might be active in several different arenas simultaneously. Our hopes with this webinar are to offer an opportunity to learn more and reflect on ways forward to build and strengthen well-functioning preventative work against honor-based violence in the Nordic region. Some practicalities are also my responsibility to inform you about. So the reports that will be presented during the webinar are published, and you can find them at nic.no. All the PowerPoint presentations will also be sent out to all your participants after the webinar. And there will not be time to take any questions during the presentations, but we will share contact details at the end of the webinar, and please don't hesitate to get in contact with your questions or comments. The webinar will be recorded, so you know, and you can watch it afterwards on YouTube. And please share it to colleagues or other interested. And finally, I also want to inform you, if you want, the webinar is in English, and if you want to have live subtitles, you have to, I'm going to try to guide you quickly how to get it. So you see there, you click the More button, and then you see the Show Captions. Then you will have the live subtitles. Okay, but before we move on to the presentations, Nina Larsson, the Swedish Minister for Gender Equality, wishes to welcome you all with some introductory words.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this important webinar on preventing honor-based violence and oppression in the Nordic countries. My name is Nina Larsson, and I am the Swedish Minister for Gender Equality. One of the government's most important priorities is to prevent and combat honor-related violence and oppression. Therefore, the Swedish government has introduced a new 7th Gender Equality Policy sub-goal: honor-based violence and oppression must end. Everyone, irrespective of gender, must have the same rights and opportunities throughout their lives to live their life without being limited by so-called honor-based norms. The new sub-goal sheds light on honor-based violence and oppression. It is an issue that has long been invisible and that affects people profoundly, often at a young age. Everyone should have the right to shape their own life, free from control, fear, and collective oppression. To concretize the new sub-goal and launch powerful measures, the government will develop an action plan against honor-based violence and oppression. The aim is to improve knowledge and working methods across the whole of society, including the justice system, schools, and social services. The government is also intensifying the development of regional resource centers. Everyone at risk of honor-based violence and oppression should have equal access to specialized support and assistance, regardless of where in Sweden they live. Thank you all for your important work with this issue. Together, we will stop honor-related violence and oppression that has no place in our society. I wish you a fruitful webinar.
Okay. Thank you, Nina Larsson. So without further ado, we'll move on to the first presentation of this webinar by welcoming Alexandra Lebedeva. She's a doctor of ethics who works at the National Center for Knowledge on Men's Violence Against Women at Uppsala University. So Alexandra has done the review of national policies in the Nordic countries, the Faroe Islands, Greenland, and Åland concerning honor-based violence. And she's also been responsible for the review of LGBTI perspective considering work against honor-based violence. Welcome, Alexandra.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this introduction, and thank you for cooperation and having this opportunity to present the results of the report. Thank you. So in this presentation, I will give a short summary of the report and focus on the main findings and the conclusions that I could draw based on the analysis that have been done. So here you can see the purpose of the report, that is to provide an overview of how the concept of honor-based violence and oppression is defined in policy documents, but also how the work is organized. But apart from mapping the work and the concepts, it has also been a critical policy analysis in order to see how the problem is represented and what kind of implications, consequences it may have. So if we look at this picture, so you can see a table that illustrates different kind of concepts that are used across different Nordic countries and territories. And the terminology may vary, but at the same time, we can see that there are some commonly used concepts, including honor-based violence, honor-based conflicts, and negative social control. But apart from looking at what concepts are used, it's also interesting to see how they are used. And again, across different Nordic countries, we can see both similarities and differences. A key commonality, I would say, is the ambiguity surrounding what these terms, including honor-based violence and negative social control, are intended to encompass, particularly in terms of the boundaries between, on the one hand, honor norms, so-called honor norms, and on the other hand, patriarchal conservative norms, so-called honor context and other contexts. So these boundaries are quite ambiguous. There is also a tendency to use honor-based violence as an umbrella concept that encompasses different kinds of practices, including female genital mutilation, forced marriage, child marriage, instead of the term that has been used before, namely harmful practices. And this reflects, on the one hand, the flexibility of the term, its political success, both in the policy work, in the media, but also it has some risks. For example, risk of including misleading portrayal of certain practices that may be motivated by other motives apart from restoring honor. The use of honor-based violence as an umbrella concept also enforces the distinction between honor-based violence and gender-based violence. So the question how honor-based violence and gender-based violence are related to each other, this question has been explored in previous research. We have, for example, Aisha Gill, professor in criminology from Essex University, who claims that we should keep the term gender-based violence while we speak about honor-based violence. And her main argument is that patriarchy still remains the main cause, the primary structural cause, while honor-based violence is an expression of patriarchy, patriarchal power, and ideology. Honor, on the other hand, is a way to justify violence. Another term, negative social control, which linguistically is not connected to the motive of honor, which represents a bit different terminology. However, if we look at how negative social control is described, so we can see that it closely resembles how honor-based violence is presented, and honor-based violence is often treated as an expression of negative social control. The distinction between negative social control and psychological violence is, on the other hand, quite unclear. It is suggested that negative social control takes place in other contexts apart from honor context. And then there is a question, what other context? What does it mean? For example, policy documents in Norway and Finland, closed religious communities are mentioned as examples of such context, where the defining feature is that the members of closed religious communities represent the majority population and not ethnic minorities. There are also some alternative concepts used, including spiritual and religious violence, and they describe violence that occurs within religious communities. The way these types of violence are presented are, for example, psychological violence with a religious dimension. When we look again at the description of violence and how it is motivated and the mechanism behind, so it's quite clear that the role of community is emphasized, hierarchies, the leadership of religious leaders, the authority of religious leaders becomes quite central. And in many respects, religious and spiritual violence bear strong similarities to the description of honor-based violence and the so-called honor norms. Finally, collective violence is another term that I could identify. It is not used in the policy documents, but it has been suggested in the research as a way to emphasize the collective dimension, particularly the difficulties in the legal systems to handle honor-based violence and the collective perpetrator, and those problems that occur while dealing with this kind of issues in Western legal systems. And that can be perhaps a concept that can be considered for the future use. Before moving forwards to the way how the problem is represented, focusing on different kind of policy areas, I would like to bring your attention to the critique raised by Greve, expert committee that has a responsibility to control how different states to the Istanbul Convention follow the convention. And here we can see that Greve notes that there has been move towards a gender-neutral approach to violence against women. The strong emphasis on cultural explanations of honor-based violence is also closely linked to this development. In practice, this means that honor-based violence is presented as patriarchal, while other forms of violence against women are increasingly described in gender-neutral terms. Greve, together with the Istanbul Convention itself, make it quite clear that honor-based violence is a form of gender-based violence, and they warn that the gendered nature of this violence risk being invisible when the focus is placed solely on culture as the root cause. At the same time, Greve stresses that this perspective does not rule out the need of specifically targeted interventions for different groups. What they're critical of, however, is the integration perspective, the idea that honor-based violence is assumed to occur among immigrants and ethnic minorities. So let us now move to the next step in the report, in the study, where I looked at how the problem is represented to be. Honor-based violence traditionally has been treated either as a question of integration or a question of gender equality, or generally men's violence against women. And we can see that it is still the case if we look at different policy areas where the issue itself is placed. So if we start with the integration perspective or integration policy, we see that in both Denmark and Norway, it is quite clear that honor-based violence is addressed within the field of integration on the strategic level. We have agencies that work directly, explicitly with integration questions that are also responsible for honor-based violence and honor-based conflicts. We can also see in Finland partly, for example, in one of the policy documents, the government program, that the issue of honor-based violence is also placed under the domain of immigration integration policies. Another way to present the problem is related certainly again to gender equality and the question of men's violence against women more generally. So in Sweden, we see that it is the Gender Equality Agency that has the central responsibility for that, as it was mentioned by the minister in the Common National Strategy on Honor-Based Violence, is formulated as a distinct sub-goal for gender equality, which means that it is still a question of gender equality, but it is also separated from another sub-goal related to violence against women, men's violence against women. We see the same problematizations in Iceland, Greenland, the Faroe Island, and Åland, where honor-based violence is represented as a question of violence against women or violence in close relationships. But apart from these two quite traditional areas, integration and gender equality, it is also possible to identify a third one, which is based on the analysis, not of the policy areas where the question belongs to, but based on the solutions, those measures that are suggested. So I suggest that upbringing issue can also be the third way to see how honor-based violence is framed. And again, it is based on the proposed solutions. And if we look at the measures, different policy documents, so there are a lot of measures that are directed towards younger groups, especially children and young people. So let us move to the separate part of the study of the report that is particularly devoted to the LGBTI perspective. And the purpose of this part was to look at how honor-based violence is represented again, but relating to this particular to this particular group, and how these kind of representations may differ from more general, but also what kind of assumptions are undermining this kind of representations. Due to the time restraints, I do not have time to go through all of the findings and the material that I have worked with, but I would like to bring up some central themes that could be identified in the material. So firstly, it is minorities within minorities. Previous studies demonstrate that there is increased focus on minorities within minorities, and there have been a shift within the Scandinavian countries towards an increased focus on LGBT people who belong to ethnic minorities. A theme of intersectional discrimination is very central. Of course, again, studies conducted in many Nordic countries demonstrate the intersectional character of discrimination, including double discrimination based on ethnic origins and religion. Apart from these more structural problems, there is also a specific question that is addressed, namely conversion attempts as a specific form of violence. Previous studies have noted that conversion attempts occur in various environments, including honor context, but also closed religious communities. And similar to the distinction made between honor context and closed religious communities with regard to the issue of negative social control, the presentation of these two different contexts can also be problematic because it is based on ethnic background of people in this context. And from the perspective of victims of violence, survivors of violence, there might be several advantages to consider the common mechanisms behind violence and its causes when we speak about honor context and closed religious communities. So I would like to finish by bringing up a couple of identified challenges. Firstly, it is of course organizational challenge or challenges which consist of insufficient resources for the proposed or suggested interventions. It is also a challenge of coordinating the work, specifically when it comes to cross-sectoral cooperation, and is also unequally distributed services among municipalities and fragmentation. Another challenge concerns legal dimensions, and this kind of challenge can also be understood differently. Partly it is a challenge as it demonstrates that the focus is mostly on reactionary measures, particularly through criminal law and criminalization. But also there are other challenges, for example, difficulty to investigate, the collective nature, the collective character, transnational element, and also the difficulty to prove the motive. But also, if we look at the current experience of Sweden, the only country in the Nordic countries where the honor-based violence is criminalized separately, we can see that the level of reports is quite low, and that is due to the lack of trust to authorities. So finally, vulnerability to multiple or intersexual discrimination should be raised. It is quite clear from the policy documents that the risk for discrimination is mentioned, but I would say that it is not appropriately addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you very much. Very interesting. So you worked with this assignment for almost 2 years now, right? So I'm just very curious about if there's anything that you specifically that sort of caught your attention or that which you reacted to during this work that you would like to share with this seminar, this webinar.
Thank you for this question. Well, since I work at the National Center on Knowledge on Men's Violence Against Women, so I both teach and I'm very familiar with the research on gender-based violence and honor-based violence. Specifically, I also follow different kind of developments, mostly in Sweden, but also in other contexts. So I'm also been aware before I started this kind of study that all of those perspectives, controversies, conflicts that also we can see both on the policy level, but also in the research. But at the same time, even though I had this knowledge, so the ambiguity, but also the circularity of the way how these terms are used, honor, norms, honor context, that are quite ambiguously defined, but they still are used as self-evident, and that is quite problematic when it comes from the strategic level to more operational level, or to the people who are working closely with victims or survivors of violence, that there is a discrepancy how we define and understand these terms. So that was one thing that was partly confirmed, but also that was like raised again as something new that I wasn't aware of. Another thing that I thought about, that we speak about the Nordic region, we know that we speak about welfare states, common history, common social structures, but at the same time, there are so many differences as well, how different social problems are managed, and the variety of these kind of measures, but also the variety of how much different countries really invest in proposing different kind of new measures and actions to be taken, which is seen as a sign of progress. If you have more measures to change something, both like preventive and reactionary, then it is treated as a sign of success or like criteria of success, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah.
Which at the same time can be also quite problematic, because all the measures and all the methods still need to be evaluated in order to say that they are successful. But there's some kind of competitive attitude can be also present.
Interesting. Thank you. Okay. We need to keep on discussing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. You'll be back a bit later in the program.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. So our next presentation focuses on the legal aspects of the work against honor-based violence in the Nordic region. So Johan Rosqvist, please welcome. Johan is a senior lecturer at the Department of Criminology and Police Work. Is that right? Yeah. At Linnaeus University. And Johan has done the review of legislation concerning honor-based violence in the Nordic region. And will now give his presentation. Thanks.
Yeah, so thank you very much. And thank you very much for the opportunity from Nick for me to have conducted this report and this overview of legislation in the Nordic countries. We have, I think in the research field, this is a completely new path, really, and a necessary path in order to create a coordinated approach towards the combating honor-related violence and oppression. When I first got this request, it immediately came to mind that when the Swedish legislation, which I'll be getting back to, in the preparatory material for that, there was a section addressing what does it look like in the other Nordic countries, and in that report or that proposal, which is of about 120 pages, this overview of what does the Nordic legislation actually look like, it was about half a page. So that is essentially the amount of knowledge that was presented, at least in Sweden at that time. That has to do with, and I will be getting back to that, that when that proposal was first written in 2018, very little had actually happened. And the majority of the legislation that I'm going to be presenting today has actually come about after 2020, with some exceptions. The very first one that was passed is actually the Swedish legislation criminalizing female genital manipulation, which was passed in 1982. But most of this legislation is actually it's been passed in the last 5, 6, 7 years or so. This report and this overview has been limited to criminal legislation, and that just simply has to do with the scope and the possibility of actually being able to study it within a reasonable amount of time and also within a reasonable amount of scope for the report. If criminal legislation is quite large to begin with, if we get into the legal fields of social legislation, of issues of migrations, and so forth, it gets very, very much more complicated and complex, and you also enter into different types of legal systems. So that was a fairly early decision that we made, was that we will limit the scope for this report, at least, to criminal legislation. What have we found? Well, this is essentially what we've found, that is actually criminal legislation within the Nordic countries. As you can see from the very top row there, those are the different countries that we categorized in there, and some of you may notice that yes, Greenland is missing, and the reason for that is that Greenland has its own criminal code, and I have gone through it, and I have read the Danish translation of it, and I have tried to find parts of that legislation that actually addresses these issues that you have on the left column, and I haven't found any. So that is why Greenland is actually omitted from the table. Denmark and the Faroe Islands. The Faroe Islands follows the Danish criminal code. So I've been going through that, the Danish translation of that. Similar when it comes to Åland, it follows the Finnish criminal code, and so I basically worked with the Finnish criminal code, but in Swedish, obviously. So what issues have I actually been looking for, and what different types of crimes have we identified here? Well, to begin with, I've been looking for codes or paragraphs that actually address a specified honor crime, that actually specify honor-related violence as a crime. And Sweden is actually the only country that uses the term honor as a specific crime. And it's a fairly recent legislation. It was passed in June, I think it was 2022, maybe July 2022. And it is what's called hedersförtryck, so honor oppression, and it is basically a repeated number of crimes committed against a person that is designed to uphold or restore that some groups or persons or often of families or other similar groups honor, and it also is a crime that is repeated over time and limits or reduces the victim's feelings of a self. The only parallel that we've found in the Nordic countries is in the Danish criminal code, where the term negative social control is actually used. And negative social control is, in a sense, it is a form of child rearing, or form of actually controlling a person who is a part of a group. And that is also criminalized as a fine or prison terms up to 3 years. All the countries, however, have what you would call aggravating circumstances, and will, to some extent, use the term honor or a similar expression, and will actually lead to a harsher sentence, or a longer prison sentence, or a higher fine, or something like that, if a person is actually hurt because of honor. The other more specific legislations that I've been going through are forced marriage and child marriage. They sort of go together. All the countries have legislation criminalizing these. Same thing when it comes to female genital cutting, and those have also been added. Apart from Sweden, as I said, where the legislation is from 1982, the other countries, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and the territories, female genital cutting are reasonably recent legislations. They have previously they have been under grievous bodily harm or similar legislation, but now they are specified as genital cutting, and they are all except for in Iceland, although it is in the definition in Iceland as well, it is specified that it's genital cutting of females, not males. I've also looked at the crime of trying to influence sexual orientation, and which essentially means that if a person has what you would call an LGBTQ sexuality or sexual orientation, that a family or other group will try to convert or convince that person to go back to a so-called normal sexuality, heterosexuality. And when this is done in some sort of systemized way, then that is also penalized in Iceland and Norway specifically. Haven't found any legislation like that in Denmark, Finland, or Sweden. And then you have in Denmark only, you have another two crimes, where one of them is clothing restrictions, which actually means forcing somebody to cover their face or their body or their head in some way. That one is quite interesting actually, because it actually relates to another paragraph which penalizes the wearing of some sort of head cover or some sort of disguise, and that actually relates to how you conduct yourself in public and in relation to demonstrations or other types of public gatherings. So what you would actually what actually happens is that if a person covers their face, then that person will be penalized for it. And the three examples that are given in a police directive of, well, what kind of covering of a head or face are we talking about? Well, we're not talking about motorcycle helmets, and we're not talking about gas masks that are used by firemen and something like that. There are there's three examples used. One is a balaclava, which would be something that you would maybe associate with people demonstrating or something like that, or disguising their face because they are committing some sort of illegal act. But the other two are the use of a veil or a hijab, which are typically female clothing, and it is also very typically associated with covering your body for sexual in order not to be sexually attractive, so to speak. And what happens there is you actually end up with a bit of a dilemma. A person is encountered in public wearing a hijab, for example, and would possibly be given a fine for that, but could possibly avoid be given the fine or other penalty by saying, well, this person who's walking beside me has made me do it. So what you would actually have to do is the victim would actually have to point out somebody else in order to avoid punishment for themselves. So that is a bit of an interesting dilemma that I would say probably would give rise to some interesting discussions around the kitchen table. Finally, I've also looked into the issue of so-called disciplining trips. It's been associated over quite a few years with the idea of that if a young person, normally a young person, a child, is encountered with doing things that are not that could threaten the family honor or the family reputation, that they are sent back often to the original country in order to attend some sort of school or other form of education. Those are not handled, generally speaking, when in the other countries as a crime. They are dealt with normally within some sort of social legislation or migration or actually the with hindering people from leaving the country. So the child is actually not given permission to leave the country. But it is not depicted as a crime. However, in Denmark, if you as a parent or other sort of family member, you take a child overseas for that sort of education, as if you will, then that could give you a fine or prison up to 4 years. So some of the more general conclusions on legislation, and I should mention also that this legislation, I will get into that. We worked on this up until I collected the materials up until about May 2025, and after that we have had some new legislation. I will give you an example of that in a few minutes. So anyway, the two countries that stick out as having the most extensive penal regulation are Denmark with the Faroe Islands and Sweden. Where Denmark and the Faroe Islands, as you saw on the table before, they are almost completely covering all of these crimes in their column, so to speak. So they have the most amount of crime descriptions. But they work on detailed crimes. Sweden instead has one single crime description, but which is very broad and actually covers a great many different types of what you would call smaller crimes that together add up into being a larger crime. In that sense, a great many different types of activities that might not be so serious individually, when they add up, they are considered to be a more serious crime. So they put a focus on this idea of what actually amounts to a negative social control, because it's a repetition of different types of violations. They don't have to be very serious, each and of themselves. It could be insults, it could be some sort of controlling use of social media and that sort of thing. But when they add up and they're actually shown to have to do with defending family honor, then they are considered more serious. Iceland is the country that has been making the most moves in the last couple of years. So almost all of the legislation, the Icelandic legislation, has been coming up during 2023, 2024. So very recently. All the countries operationalize what we call aggravating circumstances, where Finland, Poland, as well as Norway, they have a general increase. But with Denmark, Iceland, and Sweden, they specified honor-based crimes. All the countries also, they have a incomparably high punishment scale, particularly for forced and child marriage. They put a lot of emphasis on the seriousness of forced marriage and child marriages. And they all have, that was an additional study that I made, because I thought it was quite important to actually study that. All the countries have civil codes that enable the annulment of such marriages, and annulment is different from a divorce. Annulment means that if a marriage is considered to be forced or a child marriage, then it is actually is through a much quicker process. It is actually deemed not valid. Whereas with a divorce process, you are often talking about at least a 6-month waiting period and so forth. So, but that is not used here. This is an annulment. Also in Denmark and the Faroe Islands, if a person is actually heading such a ceremony, they can also be punished by themselves. So it's not just the family arranging the marriage, but it's also the person actually conducting the ceremony. That's only used in Denmark and the Faroe Islands. Control of clothing, as I mentioned before, is only used in, criminalized in Denmark, Faroe Islands. I also added this one that is not in the report. In December 2025, in Sweden, so-called virginity tests and virginity repair surgery were criminalized. So that's quite a new addition. And that, of course, it connects sort of to the idea of female genital manipulation and the check and the control of the female body, and as such, I thought I'd just put that in here just to point out that things are still happening when it comes to these legislative processes. So this is very much a living process of new legislation. Finally, Denmark and Faroe Islands, they penalize disciplining trips, whereas otherwise, oops, sorry. There we go. Whereas in other countries, that's regulated through border control or through social services. Female genital cutting, as I said, penalized in all the countries. Slight nuances in Denmark and the Faroe Islands. We're talking about genital circumcision, whereas in the other countries that you're talking about genital cutting, or which to a certain extent means that in the other countries, not in Denmark and the Faroe Islands, the expressions used indicate that it is more of a form of assault or bodily harm, whereas circumcision is perhaps a more nuanced expression, talking about that it is more of a form of manipulation. That is an ongoing debate also in the field of honor violence and oppression, whether it is actually, to what degree it is actually an honor-related crime or not. Finally, influencing sexual orientation is also specifically penalized in Iceland and Norway. It is implicitly penalized in Sweden because it is considered to be included in honor oppression, which is also similar to how it works in Denmark and the Faroe Islands, where you would call it negative social control. So there we go.
Thank you, Johan.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. A lot of information there. We will soon, is that it? We'll soon have a short break, but before that, I would like to ask you the same question that I asked Alexandra about, because you've also been working with this assignment for almost 2 years. So if there's anything specifically that you would like to share that maybe surprised you or that you sort of reacted to during your work.
Well, I think one of the things that has interested me, and Alexandra was talking about that a little bit as well. I think the slide was called "What's in a Name," is that the expressions and the terminologies are quite different between the countries, and that also I mentioned this. Female genital manipulation that is called female circumcision in Denmark. Similarly, if you look into social legislation, which I looked at to some degree at the beginning of it, and whereas in, for example, Sweden and Norway, the expression is very much more often honor-related violence or oppression. In Denmark, in social legislation or in social social services discourse, it is sometimes and quite often called honor-related conflicts, which actually puts some sort of, and it's a different idea of where of what of the power relations between the actors. I think that's quite interesting when you are comparing these countries and how they actually work out. So that was one interesting thing.
Thank you. And that's really closely related to this Nordic region that we're talking about today and the possibility to compare between them. Yeah. So we will now move on to listen to me presenting a summary of findings from a Nordic survey and consultation that's been done with practitioners working with the issue of honor-based violence in the Nordic region. So can you get the slide, please, Victor? Yes, thank you. Okay, so Nick conducted a consultation with the aim to identify common experiences, success factors, and challenges from national and civil society actors regarding prevention work and support measures, also including measures targeting LGBTI persons. And the data was collected through a questionnaire that was sent to 46 national authorities and key actors, as well as to organizations working with LGBTI rights. And the responses came from all countries and autonomous regions, and most responses came from national actors, followed by civil society actors. And we are aware that there are other actors working on these issues in the Nordic region that have not been addressed. So these results that I'm going to present now should be regarded not as a comprehensive and sort of valid for the entire field, but rather as a selection and example of successful methods. And I also want to mention that as we have heard now during the first part and the two first presentations of this webinar, that the Nordic countries and autonomous regions interpret the concept of honor-based violence in different ways. So in this survey that was sent out, the definition of the problem was kept open so that respondents could base their answers on the understanding that applies in their respective country or region. And Nick also held a Nordic network meeting with national authorities that are responsible for the work against honor-based violence in the Nordic region. And the results from the survey responses and documentation from this network meeting are summarized in a report that's also published at nick.no if you want to look into that. And based on the material and answers, we have sort of compiled a list of overall success factors, and these are common to what is considered necessary for the work against honor-based violence to be successful, regardless of target group. And we can see in the material that some of the identified factors relate more closely to the sort of direct work with victim survivors of honor-based violence, while some target success factors for building strong and sustainable and well-functioning structures for preventive work. So I will give you a couple of examples of these factors that have been identified. And first, trust and accessibility is reoccurring in the material. And I want to read a quote from the Multicultural Women Association in Finland. They say that Monica offers various forms of low threshold services in 10 different languages. It is important for individuals to receive support in their own language. So low threshold services, access to support in multiple languages, and staff with intercultural competence have proven crucial in encouraging people to seek help. And safe and inclusive environments, both physical and digital ones, also help to lower the thresholds and enable contact at an early stage. Several respondents also highlight that the trust between vulnerable individuals and community actors is a key success factor, and trust building is often the first and most important protection strategy. Hence, civil society's low threshold activities have a unique role to play, both in regard to trust and accessibility. Another factor that we identified in the material was inclusion and intersectionality in the work. And here is a quote from the government agency responsible for youth and civil society in Sweden. And then they say that in our material and lectures about honor-related violence, we highlight LGBTQ youth as a particular vulnerable group that professionals and volunteers need to pay extra attention to. So effective work against honor-based violence requires that particularly vulnerable groups are made visible and included. And experiences from both civil society and authorities show that LGBTI people with disabilities, young men, and people in strongly religious and culturally closed environments are at particular risk, but often fall outside of the regular support structures. So successful work is therefore consistently inclusive, with skills development, safe meeting places, and a rights-based working method. In regard to professionals and people working in this field, the knowledge and skills development is also identified as an important factor. And here's a very long quote from the Danish Agency for International Recruitment and Integration, Denmark. They say that the training focuses on enhancing professional skills in addressing violence in conversations, in engaging with clients in a sensitive and effective manner, in recognizing signs of honor-related violence, referring clients to appropriate services, and fostering multidisciplinary collaboration to ensure comprehensive support for those in need. So training initiatives that combine theoretical knowledge with practical tools and scenarios have proven to be most effective. And the consultation also emphasizes that including perspectives on gender, sexuality, religion, and functional variation increases both the relevance of the training and strengthens the treatment of vulnerable groups. And finally, cooperation and building a holistic support system is also a recurring theme in the material. And here is a quote from the Directorate for Integration and Diversity in Norway. They say that this combination of state-led coordination, local level support, professional training, and grassroots engagement has proven highly effective. So cross-sectoral collaboration appears to be a crucial factor for success in the work. And some authorities have succeeded in establishing structures in which social services, the police, education sector, healthcare, and nonprofit organizations work together on, for example, joint risk assessment or action plans. And at the same time, civil society's experiences shows that these forms of collaboration need to be based on mutual respect, clear mandates, and information security for it to work. So these were sort of examples of success factors, but then obviously we also identified quite a few remaining needs in the material. And this is sort of the other side of the coin. Because if we see that an important success factor is the skills and knowledge development, for example, then obviously the lack of knowledge and competence is a challenge in the preventive work. So professionals that lack sufficient knowledge to identify honor-based violence, limited understanding of how honor-based violence manifests, lack of research-based and evidence-based knowledge in political and legal decision-making, and also insufficient implementation of existing knowledge in practice are identified as remaining needs in the work. The same goes for trust and accessibility. Obviously, one of the very important preventative factors. Then the need for trust-building measures are big. There's still challenges in reaching affected families and target groups in preventive work. Many victims do not seek help due to fear and stigma. And there's a difficulty in building trust with affected individuals. So the need for low threshold services, safety, and long-term follow-up is still a remaining need in the Nordic work. Sorry. And as we saw earlier, that inclusion and intersectionality are identified as sort of success factors, important factors, which means that if we do not work with an inclusive strategy, then the risk of stigmatization and oversimplified images are big. And there's also a risk that certain vulnerable groups are not identified in the work. And finally, the lack of insufficient coordination or systematization is also a remaining need in the Nordic work. Lack of coordination between authorities is identified in the material, unclear division of responsibilities, for example, between state and municipalities. There are a lot of short-term government assignments that hinder the long-term collaboration that we know we need. There's an insufficient allocation of resources and also a lack of organizational decisions and prioritization in municipalities and regions. So we do know quite a lot about how to work to prevent honor-based violence, but there's still a lot of remaining needs for it to be possible in the Nordic region. And much of this work has to be done at sort of a national level, a municipality level, maybe even a local level. But the question for us and for Nick is also, and for this webinar is also, whether a stronger Nordic cooperation could be helpful in strengthening and meeting some of these identified needs. And when it comes to Nordic cooperation, there is currently no structured framework in place. There's a lack of resources and mandates, but as part of this assignment, Nick also took initiative to facilitate meetings between national authorities responsible for the work against honor-based violence, sort of a seed to a Nordic network. And I'll just mention a few things that this network has identified as things that need to be done at a Nordic level, things that none of us can solve on our own. For example, exchanges between municipalities across national borders. This is where much of the practical values of a Nordic network lies. Strong personal and professional Nordic networks are also important, knowing who to call in another country, especially in very complex situations. The network also discussed the need for joint results in policy and practice, such as joint recommendations, joint tools, and knowledge developed together. And another area that was highlighted was the dialogue between research and practice that could help connect experiences, issues, and knowledge across borders. And finally, a need was identified for some sort of common way to managing and storing knowledge. National systems are not enough if we really want to find and use each other's work. So this Nordic network are now currently looking at ways to formalize and to make it sustainable over time. So we're looking forward to seeing where that ends up. I would like to just end with one last quote from the material, because I think it's a very nice quote. It's from SUPU, a non-government organization in Finland. And they say that we believe that true safety and long-term well-being do not come solely from relocating individuals, but through a holistic approach, careful risk assessments, and trust-based work with a wider social network. So, thank you. And with that, I'll find another. Okay. Yeah, please. We will now start the last part of this program. But I think that we could see this Menti QR code again, or a new one. Yes. So first, I just would like you all to scan this QR code and just answer a couple of questions for the evaluation of this webinar. That would be very helpful for us and the organizers. Yes. Okay, so after listening to these interesting presentations, we also wish to close this webinar now with a discussion about Nordic cooperation and ways forward. And to do that, we've been joined by Trine Skriver Höholt Andersen, yes, Senior Advisor here at the Nordic Welfare Center, and Alexandra Lebedeva. Welcome back.
Thank you.
So first, Trine, maybe you would like to say something about Nordic Welfare Center.
Yeah, of course. I'm part of Integration Nord, which is a smaller department under and a subject within Nordic Welfare Center. So our main focus is trying to do some of the things that you just highlighted. So we try to help policymakers and stakeholders across the Nordic countries actually use knowledge and use policies that we know, initiatives that we know work. So we do this by doing two things. We try to be a source for Nordic knowledge, a place where you can find either our reports, sister organizations as Nick's report for today, within topics that might touch upon integration, And beside that, we also do our own reports where we try to collect and map the situation across the Nordic countries and what is going on within the integration area. So for that reason, we also have an earlier report on this topic from 2020. And one of the conclusions in that report were that we needed a continued mapping of the area because it was very much evolving and the legislation was very much evolving at that point as well. And what we saw when Johan just presented was that that is exactly what has happened. It was necessary to continue this work. And for that reason, the Nordic cooperation also across Nordic organizations is very important in continuing making efforts to have the newest knowledge and know what is actually going on now. The other thing we do is that we try to be a node for Nordic cooperation and knowledge exchange. So we try to also facilitate some of these networks and also do help with webinars, conferences, meetings, and connections between the different municipalities or ministries across the Nordic countries. So if you're sitting out there wondering what is happening in this and this municipality in Norway and you're from Denmark, reach out. We might have a connection. We would be able to maybe facilitate. And that's how we try to do our work. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So I would like to go back to you, Alexandra. And okay, so after your work with this extensive overview that you presented earlier, what are your thoughts on the needs for the future preventative work against honor-based violence in the Nordic region?
Thank you. Let me just comment on your on what you said, particularly about the evolving area and that there are so many changes taking place. This. Thanks. And in this respect, maybe the study that I have done, it does not make justice for all the changes that have taken place, all the measures, initiatives that have been taken, and that it is again a sign that this work needs to be continuous, that we need to do these kind of mappings, but also critical analysis, that they should continue. We cannot just stop now. Okay, now we know how it looks like, because it has changed. It has already changed since the time when I collected the material. In terms of future preventive work, I think the focus should be particularly on this preventive aspect, because what I could see in my study, even though there are, again, a lot of measures that are taken in terms of preventive work, the focus is still quite reactionary on the reactionary work. We can see that it's a lot of law and order. It is risk and safety measures, which are very important. But preventive work mainly consists of education and training, which is also important, but it should be supplemented. If we see that honor-based violence and oppression, negative social control is a social problem, then I think we need to have a more holistic picture, and that resembles the last quote, but also the successful factors that you have identified and the problems. I think the holistic approach is very important, that we cannot treat honor-based violence as isolated phenomena, as a phenomena that exist in a vacuum. We also need to consider social inequalities, structures when it comes to segregation, when it comes to labor market, access to health. All these aspects need to be included. And that is not an easy answer, and that is not an easy way to go. But I think if we want actually to work towards trust and towards opening authorities and agencies to people that they can actually feel that they can and want to seek help, then I think there is no other way. There is no easy way here. I think I can stop here.
Can I answer that?
Yes.
I think that is exactly why work like this is needed, and why we at a Nordic level might learn from each other, because the holistic approach is also easier to do when you see a problem from different angles. And what your report did was also highlighting how it is organized within different themes, within the different Nordic countries, making it obvious that you hit different target groups, and you also train personnel with different focuses when trying to identify the problems. That makes us able to learn which group do Norway see that Denmark doesn't see, which group does Denmark catch to a larger degree than Norway doesn't, when we try to focus differently. For that reason, it's also quite important to see it in the different countries and see if we organize it at a national level, we might reach further out, but be harder to have the one-to-one with the one victim. Where if we organize it at a more communal municipality level, the one-to-one might be easier, but instead the more securing that everyone get the same access to the same help is harder. So I think that is very one of the very strong things in a Nordic collaboration is this learning from each other. And I think one of the things that might be a very good example of this is these mangfoldighedsvejledere and the competence teams that are across the different Nordic countries, and sikkerhedskonsulenterne in Denmark, which is actually an initiative that we know and have learned from different Nordic countries that works, but it works in the different Nordic countries because you have adapted it to the legislation and the way that we have organized it in that country.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a lot of competence, and there needs to be much more change. May I just add
yes,
one?
please,
We have time.
Please, yes.
I think that in terms of the report that I did, so it was focused on the strategic level, right? So how different policy documents address and how the concept is understood. But it also should be complemented by identifying how professionals who are meeting the victims and survivors understand this concept and how they implement. And the next step is also to look and have more research-based knowledge how victims themselves identify their exposure to violence. If it is tenable to proceed with the use of honor-based term, this terminology, or maybe there are some other ways to use different concepts, but most profoundly how to find the ways to open all kind of institutions and support and help initiatives to people who need it. So I think that should be somehow complemented, perhaps.
And if I might answer that, then I think one of the things that are very useful in that regard within the Nordic countries, and when we do these kind of networks with people from the different organizations that have the responsibility for handling victims across the Nordics, is that we can actually knowledge share, because some of these extreme outcomes are rare.
Yeah.
The number of cases in the different countries are not that large. It's a very significant crime. It's a very damaging experience for a victim, but the opportunity for the different organizations to actually have the knowledge and know how to handle it is very hard when we only have a few cases within a year in all the countries. So for that reason, it would be a shame not to learn from each other within the topic. And I think some of the things that you also touch upon here is that we need to be able to identify the right characteristics that characterize the group. So we don't do all of this based on it's an integration matter. So it's just being born with outside of the Nordics that are a cultural thing for this, but instead looking at some of the other things that might actually signify this, that also coincide to a large degree with the group of immigrants we have from non-Western countries, having a lower attachment to the labor force, being in a home where there is lower stability, higher stress, all of these things that also in a native Nordic home would maybe result in unwanted behavior. So yeah.
I cannot agree more.
Okay, thank you. So Trine, what do you see now looking forward? Do you want to say anything else, something more about the need for the Nordic cooperation in this field?
A lot of initiatives have been made. and this is a good start.
Mm.
And I think that we continue to shift the topic back and forth, and it continues to be relevant, and we continue to look at it and update the knowledge is what I see should continue to happen.
Mm.
And to a larger degree, also this sharing of initiatives that work. Because as you said, a lot of what we have now is legislation that criminalizes behavior. What we want to do is we want to support the victims. We want to try to make sure it doesn't happen, that people get the needed help. Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to add something, Alexandra? Or do you feel
No, there were so many wise things said.
wise things said? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So, yeah, thank you, Trine and Alexandra. Our time is up here. So, again, want to remind you to please answer the Menti that you saw. Yeah, scan that QR code. So I just want to say thank you very much to our presentators, and thank you to Nordic Welfare Center that we could use these facilities and do this webinar in cooperation with them. Thank you to Victor, our technical, the one responsible for the technical part of this webinar. Very good. And yeah, like I mentioned in the beginning of the webinar as well, please visit nic.no to read the Nordic overview, and the PowerPoint presentations will be sent out to all your participants. So yeah, with that, I wish you all a good Tuesday afternoon and good luck to all of us in the important work that's being done around the Nordic region to prevent honor-based violence.